Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ben Bankhurst. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Bankhurst is the Ray and Madeline Johnston Chair in American History and Associate Professor of History at Shepherd University. He completed his graduate study at King's College London. His research focuses on migration to the Appalachian frontier in the colonial and revolutionary periods. Before joining the history department at Shepherd, he held teaching and research appointments at the London School of Economics, the Institute of Historical Research, and Queen Mary University of London. His articles have appeared in journals including Ireland, the Pennsylvania Magazine for History and Biography, and the Journal of Irish and Scottish History, among others. The American Council for Irish Studies awarded his first book, which is entitled Ulster Presbyterians and the Scots-Irish Diaspora, 1750 to 1764, was awarded the Donald Murphy Prize. Dr. Bankhurst Ben co-edited a collection of essays alongside Nigel Aston entitled Negotiating Toleration, Protestant Dissent, and the Hanoverian Secession. He is co-director alongside with Dr. Kyle Roberts of the Maryland Loyalist Project, a public archive and database documenting the experiences of Chesapeake Loyalists in the era of the American Revolution. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bankhurst.
Well, thank you to Historic Shepherdstown for the invitation to speak. Thanks to Jerry. Thanks to everybody for showing up. I have to say, after having heard all of the introductions to the new board members, I feel underqualified to be here. But today, I'm going to, and I'd also, this is not a great way to start, but I'd like to start with an apology. I'm going to be talking about our region, but I will not necessarily be talking very much about Shepherdstown. It does come up once, but beyond that, I'm kind of taking a regional approach to the history of loyalism, the era of the American Revolution. In a town that prides itself for the Beeline March in 1775, it's not a topic that really comes up very often. So I'm hoping to remedy that slightly here today. In so doing, I'll be showing, I couldn't resist the opportunity to kind of show some of the work that our students have been doing in digital history. So I will start with the slideshow, and at a certain point I hope I'll be able to navigate the technology to bring up some of their work and then go back at a certain point. But let's start here. Okay. Okay, as the United States, and I'm going to take this off, I'm sorry. Lasting at 30 seconds. As the United States prepares to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and in so doing assesses the legacy of the American Revolution in the 21st century, one thing is certain. Loyalism is having a moment. Examples of new scholarship on the topic abound in recent years. In the Carolinas, Rebecca Brandon's work, Rebecca is located at James Madison University's Shenandoah Valley, on post-revolutionary the post-revolutionary reintegration of loyalists, and Brendan McConville's study on religion have led us to rethink the struggle for the South following the fall of Charleston. While Christopher Minty's work on New York has shown the pervasive influence of loyalist networks along the Long Island Sound up to 1783. Meanwhile, new digital projects out of the University of New Brunswick and Toronto in Canada have brought loyalist source material to new audiences. And finally, prolific scholars, including Simon Schama, have probed into Black loyalist experiences, perhaps one of the areas, the growth areas in loyalist studies that has been most needed, I'd say, over the last decade. I could go on and on. The reasons for this loyalist turn are many, and I will just posit a few here. Current political divisions in the United States, in particular the co-opting of the revolution, its symbols and language, by the populist right might explain why some scholars have looked to loyalism with its emphasis on order, political consistency, and the preservation of institutions. The losers of the revolution, no longer the conniving sycophants of patriot propaganda, appear more human and relatable given the turmoil of recent years. So that might underscore why there's been some shift towards loyalist studies. I was asked this question pointedly at the American Philosophical Society when I delivered a lecture on this topic. The director said, "Why am I hearing so much about loyalists? Why are loyalists everywhere now?" And I couldn't think of an answer then, but I'm trying one now. But perhaps the simplest answer to the question of loyalism's sudden popularity is that the time has finally come for a crucial aspect of our nation's founding to be told. Whether we like it or not, the experience and treatment of loyalists is part of the founding story, our story, with repercussions that resonate to the present day. The upcoming anniversary might allow us the opportunity to reckon with the reality that our founding moment emerged within the context of a civil war. For too long, scholars have dismissed those who remain loyal to the crown as the losers of the American Revolution. Tens of thousands, perhaps as many as 100,000 people left the young United States to start their new lives elsewhere in the British Empire. Early historians sought to vilify them, historians of the United States, or write them out of the histories of the American Revolution. Recent excellent published scholarship on the topic of loyalism has also left Maryland relatively unexplored, or underexplored. Today, as we look to the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in Maryland, many interested people, scholars, genealogists, museum professionals, and descendants, are actively seeking to recover these stories. They recognize the necessity of understanding how people navigated a time of intense political turmoil, especially how thousands of women and men enslaved by patriot families used the war to secure their freedom by running to British lines. The purpose of this evening's presentation, then, is twofold. First, I would like to take the opportunity to showcase a project that our students and the community members, I don't know if Tom Benner is here, but he helped with this project a great deal, so I want to give him kudos. I'm attempting to showcase a project that our students and community members have produced over the last 4 years, the Maryland Loyalist Project. In so doing, I will illustrate what we know about the Loyalists and how our image of the Loyalists is really the product of the archive that has been available to us since the Revolution. Second, I want to look at our region in order to illuminate underexplored aspects of the Loyalist experience during the American Revolution. The greater Shenandoah Valley, often portrayed as a bastion of support for the American cause, was in some areas anything but. Neighboring Washington County experienced a pang of a Loyalist panic in 1781, and so that would be kind of a case study that I would like to use tonight to get at the kind of the experience of the Western Loyalists, an underexplored topic. Certainly within the context of the study of the American Revolution, but also within the context of Loyalist studies in general. But before we do any of that, I do want to. I said I would showcase something that we have been working on in the history department, and that I will take. Force this on you. This is the American Loyalism Project, and just for some background here. It's a student, it's a multi-generational student project in which students in my American Revolution class have been allowed access to the two principal archives, the archives of the Loyalist Claims Commission in London, we'll talk about that in a second, and the inspection rolls which document the experiences of Black Loyalists. They've then searched through these archives and created an attended database and a virtual library of transcriptions based upon that course material. So this project was funded partially by the Omohundro Institute for Early American Studies at the College of William and Mary, and partially by Maryland here. So we have the inspection rolls. These document these stories of black loyalists after the British evacuation of 1783. And then we have evidence volumes compiled by the Loyalist Claims Commission following their formation in 1783. The Loyalist Claims Commission is a parliamentary commission that was established when it was very clear that the British were going to lose the war. Its primary goal was to provide restitution to Loyalist refugees both in Canada, principally in Halifax, and those who made it across the ocean to Britain. So you can think of it as a sort of a kind of an insurance company. I mean, they essentially, the Loyalists would put forward an insurance claim. They would document what they lost as a byproduct of their, or as a product of their loyalty to the crown. They would also provide a little mini narrative in which they would tell the commissioners how they suffered in the struggle for American independence. With the hope, obviously, is to maximize the amount of money they can get out of Parliament, right? So everybody suffers in these narratives. So you have to take them with a grain of salt. So I'm just going to quickly pull up one of the evidence volumes from 1785 and then read. The reason I pulled this one up is because it holds, I want to focus on the experience of one man, Robert Alexander, to illustrate a wider point, that these volumes have been the bedrock of Loyalist studies since the end of the American Revolution. And as such, the image of the Loyalist that we have in our popular imagination is largely the byproduct of the stories told in the LCC archive, the Loyalist Claims Commission Papers archive. And so what I would like to do now is kind of paint a portrait of the typical Loyalist, and then we'll turn to this memorial of Robert Alexander. In so doing, I just wanted everybody to remember that this is a very flawed portrait, yet it's the one that I think most of us harbor regarding the Loyalists. With the launch of the website, Maryland Loyalism website in 2020, we included in our initial launch 5 volumes that contain 73 different memorials by white male and a handful of female petitioners to the Loyalist Claims Commission, and 3 volumes that list the experiences of 55 different black women and men who freed themselves from patriot enslavers and were listed in the inspection rolls, another archive that I'll turn to in a second, before they were evacuated out of the British held city of New York to a new life in Canada and the Bahamas. The MLP, as innovative as it may be in many respects, does, however, reinforce a traditional narrative about loyalism, in particular, a familiar story of the experience of white loyalists. This is because the project is built upon a source base long familiar to historians from the 1830s onwards, a source base that focuses on the refugees, those who escaped the United States and made it to either Halifax or London, where they could tell their stories to Parliament. In order to have done that, you served in the British military and you were evacuated with the troops, or you were rich enough or well placed to get out. You were in the East, for instance. So there's a high proportion of the people represented in the LCC represent sort of the professional classes of the eastern port towns. Many, though certainly not all, refugees that went before the LCC hailed from the coastal districts near ports, making their departure possible. And/or they had the financial means to afford the journey across the ocean to support themselves in either London or Halifax. Of these people, a significant proportion were office holders of some sort, either clerical or governmental, or were merchants who had built their careers on Atlantic trade. Both office holders and merchants, therefore, depended upon the British connection for their livelihoods, and that might underscore why they remained loyal to it. They had an economic incentive to do so. Finally, given the large concentration of Eastern considered moneyed interests and other office holders among the LCC memorialists, it is no surprise that many of the refugees who appealed to Parliament for aid made their decision to support the Crown early in the war and were perhaps swayed to pick a side by the Declaration of Independence. Some of them had been committed Whigs or had initially supported the American position during the imperial crisis of the 1760s and early 1770s, but viewed independence simply as a step too far. So we'll paint that portrait in a second. I do quickly want to go over these statistics and put them into some context. John Adams famously said, when reflecting on the American Revolution, that a third of the population were what he called hot patriots, a third of the population were vile Tories or loyalists, and then the final third just wanted an easy life and were swayed by whichever army happened to be closest. And that was his and that's not too far from the truth. Our current estimates are that about, and we're kind of skewing towards the high end here, about 20% or 1 in 5 Americans during the American Revolution remained loyal to the Crown up until 1783. 75,000 of those loyalists escaped. They made it out of the country. Most of them went to Canada, obviously, where they established the new Anglophone provinces of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And they represent 1 out of every 40 Americans, right, were a loyalist exile after the American Revolution. To put it in perspective, the percentage of the population that fled the French Revolution was something like 1 in 83. So this is a higher percentage of the overall population of the early United States fleeing the American Revolution. So, but let's go back to our portrait of the typical white loyalist. And I've included here, that's an image of London the Lincoln's Inn Fields in London. This was a site that the commission met for 6 years and heard all of these pleas for restitution from American refugees. When we look at these in their totality, these LCC records, we find that the loyalists, what was the typical loyalist? Well, they hailed from the east, perhaps a coastal port or town, as I've said. They were an office holder of some description. That usually meant that they were either an Anglican priest who refused to abjure their oath of allegiance to the King of England, or they were a political appointee of some sort. Thomas Hutchison of Massachusetts, the last will governor of Massachusetts, is perhaps the most well-known of that type of loyalist. A higher percentage were merchants, or were, I should say, married to someone fitting this description. We do see quite a few women go before the Loyalist Claims Commission, but they're usually widows. And so they're trying to plead with the commission in order to establish their connection to a loyalist and to try to get sympathy, extract sympathy from the Claims Commission. They were likely foreign-born. A high percentage of loyalists were not American-born. Many of them were British immigrants, so this makes sense. An overwhelming proportion of those British immigrants were Scots. Namely, this is certainly true of the Carolinas and the Eastern Carolinas, and it's certainly true of Northern Virginia as well. The average Scot was likely to sympathize with the British on this one. Finally, they were likely to be an ideological loyalist, perhaps someone who chose loyalty soon after independence was declared. And there's a lot of argument within loyalists, within the circles of loyalist scholars, as to what is a loyalist, who is a loyalist? Can you include Cherokee as loyalists because they allied with the crown? Do they count? Should you include enslaved people who fled to British lines seeking freedom? Are they loyalists? And often these debates boil down to a question of ideology. Are they making an ideological commitment to monarchism or to the British connection? And a high proportion of the LCC refugees fit that bill. Right? So many of them are ideological loyalists, and we know that because they tell us that the final straw, the reason they left, was the Declaration of Independence. That they sympathized with the Americans up to that point, but following that, they just simply, that's a step they couldn't take. Many of them fit that description. So with that said, we return quickly to the American Loyalist Project. One of the people I think that best fits this description from the transcriptions that our students did was a man named Robert Alexander. So, Robert Alexander, who dates 1740 to 1805, was a lawyer and politician and had initially supported the American cause as a delegate to the Continental Congress from Maryland. He attended both the First and Second Continental Congress, had been a voting member, had been elected as late as 1776 by the new state legislature to serve another term before going over to the British. When the British, he also stated that the reason he decided he couldn't go any further was the demolition of the defense. That was a step too far. When British forces arrived in Maryland as part of the Philadelphia campaign, he entertained them at his house, which is in present-day Elkton, Maryland. 3 days earlier, he had entertained his old friend George Washington in the same house, which brought him the scorn of many of his neighbors. He evacuated to Philadelphia with the British, and then finally off to the British citadel of New York City, where he played an active role garnering support for the cause of the crown. He was elected to the British board to direct and control operations of the Associated Loyalists from 1781 to 1782. So he became an active provocateur in London, funneling money through his networks back in Annapolis to Loyalists on the ground in Maryland. In 1780, the state of Maryland judged Alexander guilty of high treason and threatened him with execution should he ever return to the state. At that point, they seized most of his property. His estate became the town of Elkton, Maryland, although the wife he had abandoned was allowed to keep the main house that his father had built in 1735. He never saw his wife or the house again, and died fairly poor in exile in London in November 1805. So he hits a lot of the criteria that I had described as somebody who would be a loyalist. He's a politician. He's an office holder, right? Early on in his career, a lot of his rise could be counted towards the patronage with the then ruling governor of Maryland. He was drawn to make an ideological choice in 1776. He decided that yes, he may sympathize with his fellow colonists, but he's not nearly ready to make that jump into the dark as Dickinson in Continental Congress would call him later. So again, he represents this figure of the loyalist, what we might stereotypically think of as a loyalist. Back to but if we look at all of the LCC claims, all the Loyalist Claims Commission papers for the state of Maryland, we find that there are 82 claimants. 27% are American born. That means that the 73% are not. They're born. There's a high percentage of British-born immigrants and a pretty high percentage of Germans. And we'll talk about the Germans in a second. There's 42% of them are merchants or tradesmen. 24% have professional employment, including 9 Anglican clerics. 19% are office holders, and a mere 14% are farmers, which is remarkable when you consider that the vast majority of Americans at the time would have been farmers, over 90%. So we're not seeing the average farmer represented in the LCC records. And with that, I want to turn to our final. Here's the payoff, everyone. I mean, I know you've been asking yourself, what the hell is this guy talking about? This has nothing to do with this story. Here we go. All right. So now, if we turn to the west, if we turn to our region, we can garner a more nuanced view of what a loyalist may have looked like at the tail end of the American Revolution. So, as I said, those early loyalists, they make an ideological choice early on in the war, usually tied to the Declaration of Independence. But what about those loyalists who remained committed to loyalism but couldn't get out, or who remained in situ in the West, an area that is dramatically underrepresented in the LCC records that the students have transcribed. What about them? Let's look to a case study to see what their experience was. So how might another source base complicate our understanding of loyalism? Let's turn to an event and its aftermath that upended communities across Frederick and Washington counties and troubled the Annapolis government throughout the second half of 1781. The discovery of a widespread loyalist conspiracy in Western Maryland. How many of you have heard of the Frederick treason trials? If you go to Frederick today and you go to the courthouse, there's a small plaque depicting where the executions took place. But it's an event that looms large over the oral history of Frederick County. And it looms large for a specific reason, the means of execution. And so we'll talk about that in a second. Before we go into the specifics of the conspiracy and the trial that followed, it would perhaps be helpful to briefly flesh out what was happening in Maryland and Virginia in the summer of treason, in the summer of 1781. Now, today we tend to think of 1781 as the year in which the British Army was finally defeated, vanquished at the siege of Yorktown in October of that year. We sometimes lazily assume that American victory was inevitable, and that everything that preceded it, following Cornwallis's march into Virginia from North Carolina, was somehow a prelude to British defeat. For those who lived in the Upper South, indeed in this area at the time, however, Cornwallis's entry into Virginia did not feel like a retreat. Rather, it seemed to usher in a new stage of the war. Finally, the war would come to Virginia. Finally, the war would come to Maryland. It had been everywhere else, right? Now it's here. Let's remember that in the summer of 1781, the British swept the field at a number of battles as they advanced into Virginia. Master Tarleton, the terror of the Carolinas, came within hours, minutes even, of capturing the then governor of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, at his home in Monticello. It's a narrow escape. Tarleton's foray into the West threatened the British prisoners of war camps that had been established at Winchester, Virginia, forcing the Congress to move the prisoners taken from the Battle of Saratoga, the so-called Convention Army, north, down the valley, and here's where Shepherdstown came, through Shepherdstown, and to the relative safety of Frederick, Maryland. So there we see that things look so uncertain in Virginia. There was such a fear that those British prisoners of war could be freed by a daring raid by Cornwallis's army that they had to move those prisoners out of the safety of the Shenandoah Valley, the upper Shenandoah Valley, and into Maryland, closer to Washington's army, further from the British. The government in Annapolis was not too happy about suddenly having to host a couple thousand Hessian and British prisoners. They wondered if Baltimore might be Cornwallis's target. They wondered this as they received letters from militia captains and worried farmers along the bay describing daring British nautical raids up and down the Chesapeake aimed at unprepared and undefended plantations. Adding to their misery was news that a great loyalist conspiracy had been discovered among the Germans of Frederick County. Frederick and Washington counties, I should say. A region that now hosted those thousands of captured British soldiers. The nature of the Loyalist plot was such. Apparently, disgruntled German farmers decided that they would march on the barracks, the Hessian barracks, and the jail in Frederick. They would free the prisoners, and then they would take those free prisoners and march them south to join Cornwallis. By this point in the war, enthusiasm for the American cause was on the wane. And this is across the United States, but it's certainly true across the Mid-Atlantic. The government in Maryland increased conscription and heavy taxations in order to deal with the now very real threat of British invasion. These moves were not popular in many communities who had lived through 6 years of conflict. The Frederick Loyalist conspiracy was but one of numerous small-scale Loyalist uprisings across Virginia and Maryland in 1781. This was truly a period of alarm, and in some parts of the new state, outright panic. And that's something that we need to remember as we move forward here. We complacently think of 1781 as the year the war ended. Throughout most of that year, it didn't look that that was going to be the case. And I'll just name a few of the other Loyalist conspiracies. In Virginia, the New River settlements rose in rebellion against Thomas Jefferson's government. Up in Hardy and Grant County, the Claypool Rebellion raged early in the year. And in fact, the Annapolis government was fearful that this was part of a Grant conspiracy, and that Claypool was to march on Frederick and join these potential rebels before joining the Cornwallis. The Governor and Council of Maryland received news of the conspiracy in the West in June 1781, when orders were given to the lieutenants of the Frederick and Washington County militias to arrest a number of, quote, disaffected and dangerous persons whose going at large may be detrimental to the state. Among those singled out for arrest were people with surnames that many of you may know: Henry Newcomer and Bletchley of Washington County, and Caspar Fritchie, Kelly, and Tinkles of Frederick County. All these men had been connected to a supposed plot to raise a group of armed loyalists in Western Maryland. The details of the plot were uncovered by a man named Christian Orendorff, a militia captain within the vicinity of Sharpsburg, Washington County. His neighbor, Henry Newcomer, had confided to him the nature of the plot. Orendorff promptly told county officials, and many of the men implicated by Newcomer were quickly arrested. 7 men who could be caught were condemned to stand trial. They were all German speakers, hailing from the 2 western counties. They were implicated as the supposed leaders of the conspiracy, and their names were Peter Suman, Nicholas Andrews, John Graves, Adam Graves, Jost Flecker, Henry Schell, and Caspar Fritchie. Thomas Sprigg, serving as lieutenant of Washington County, wrote to the council in Annapolis that, quote, they acknowledge themselves to be captains, that they have misted and administered the oath of allegiance to many persons, one of them to the amount of 42 people. They confess they were free. They confess very freely that they say they expect and deserve to be hanged, and I pray God that they may not be disappointed. It is important to note, and this is where the slide comes into being, that this is not that the trial that ensued was not a trial at the county level. Given the nature of the crime, treason, a special court of oyer and terminer was called in Frederick. This court's authority superseded local county courts. It met on June 17, 1781, and was overseen by commissioners, including the local militia captain, Colonel James Johnson, this man, Alexander Hanson, and Upton Sheridan. Orendorff's testimony was the key piece of incriminating evidence in this short trial, and we'll take a look at that in a second. I just quickly want to introduce you to Alexander Conti Hanson. He's a patriot, a one-time private secretary to George Washington. He becomes the judge of the General Court of Maryland under the 1776 state constitution. He's a well-known pamphleteer, and later on in life he becomes the Chancellor of Maryland. So he's a well-connected man, a clear patriot, and somebody who's an outsider, who represents sort of the eastern interest in Frederick County. But I said that Orendorff's testimony is what sent these people to the gallows. So I think it's worth going over in some detail here. Just that we don't know exactly what happened and how the plot was discovered. There are 2 stories in the Frederick oral tradition about the discovery of the plot. They both take place in nearby Sharpsburg. One is that Christian Orendorff, a German-speaking militia captain and friend of Henry Newcomer, was told the plot because Henry Newcomer trusted him. He thought he had loyalist sympathies. The other explanation is that this guy, Christian Orendorff, was just in the right place at the right time. That Newcomer had come to give information about the plot to a man who he was told would be dressed in a militia outfit standing on the corner of High Street in Sharpsburg. And so lo and behold, when he comes on the appointed day, he sees this man. It doesn't happen to be the informer he's looking for. but that he spills the beans, and that's how the plot is uncovered. So those are the two theories as to how this happened. Anyway, so this is Christian Orndorff's testimony about the discovery of the plot. So he says in June of 1781, about a fortnight ago, Henry Newcomer of Washington County came to him in Sharpsburg and called him out of his father's house and asked what he thought of these times. It's a sort of code, I guess. Orndorff answered that the times were very bad and precarious. Of course they were. He then asked if he thought the king would overcome this country. Orndorff answered he thought he might. Newcomer said he was sure he will overcome the country, and then launched into his plan. He asked if Newcomer asked if Orndorff could keep a secret. Orndorff said yes. He couldn't, apparently, but that's neither here nor there. And then Newcomer explained what was to happen. He said, "I will lead you into a matter of great importance." He said he would have raised a body of men for the service of the king, and we thought proper to make application to you to go to New York for a fleet. Asked how many men they had raised, he said upwards of 6,000. Asked who was the commanding officer of the party, he answered one Fritchie of Fredericktown. And this one line is what will lands. Caspar Fritchie becomes the fall guy of the conspiracy, and it's because of this statement. In locals, there's so much wrong with the old record in Sharpsburg and in Frederick about what happened here. But the old families, namely the Fritchie family of Frederick, that Fritchie family, if you know the story of the Lee's invasion of the Civil War, same family. In that family, they claim that he was a stooge. He was just an innocent German, illiterate farmer who had been blamed for this. He was a fall guy. He didn't do anything wrong. That's certainly not true when we look at the evidence, but that's what they claim. Newcomer then said he said some of his officers were so violent for the fight that he was afraid it would be made public. Asked who there were, he said one Kelly, a lawyer, and an Irishman. Obviously there's an Irishman involved. Who lives in the mountains about 12 or 14 miles from Fredericktown. So again, this is the testimony given to the court in Frederick on the 18th of June. What happens next was quick. They met for a day, and then the court was apparently so spooked by what they found that they issued a rather hasty judgment. And this is what, if you ask people in Frederick what they remember about the treason plot, this is what they remember. This is perhaps one of the earliest printed works from Frederick County, Maryland. This is a broadside printed by a German printer named, we think, Matthias Bartkus in 1781, and then it was circulated to the Germans of Frederick County. You can see why in a second. So let's read it all. The court deems that they would be carried to jail of Frederick County, and there be drawn from thence to the gallows of Fredericktown, and be hanged thereon, that they be cut down to the earth alive, that their entrails be taken out and burnt while they are yet alive, that their heads be cut off, and that their bodies be divided into 4 parts, and their quarters be placed where His Excellency the Governor shall direct and appoint. That's the medieval, it's the medieval judgment for treason. It's what happened to William Wallace, right? The same penalty. But I want to focus on this broadside for a second. Because what's fascinating, we know the judgment, but what's fascinating about the broadside is that it's clearly, I think it's an indication of kind of the panic that had ensued in Frederick County following the discovery of this plot. This is very clearly, deliberately printed in both English and German. From what we gathered, it's printed, there's over 100 copies that are disseminated across the county. And clearly what they're trying to do is scare the hell out of any prospective loyalists. And to try to ferret out, get people to start informing on those who may be tied to the conspiracy. So, this leads us to a question. Did they do this? In Frederick, and let me just, I have an interesting story, and I know this is being recorded. I hope Jody Bromwich wouldn't be upset if I shared this, but he knows one of the descendants of Peter Schumann, one of the men who was executed. And Schumann took him to a potter's field on one occasion and said, this is where my ancestors buried. And then he ended by saying, well, parts of it. Right? And an unmarked grave out there. So the question is, did they do this? Was the sentence meted out as it was described in that broadside? And the answer very clearly is no, they didn't. I think the Annapolis government interceded at a certain point and said, this looks very bad for us. If we're the people who did this, right? But how do we know? So here's how we know. Firstly, the only evidence that we had that it was the executions, at least for 3 of these people, were carried out, is in the newspapers for the state of Maryland. So on the Friday, the 17th of instant, Caspar Fritchie, Peter Suman, and Joseph Plecker suffered death in Fredericktown for high treason. That's all we know from the newspapers. But from the work that our students at Shepherd have done, transcribing for the Maryland Loyalist Project, interestingly, there's a reference to the Loyalist conspiracy in one of the in some of the evidence that was provided to the Loyalist Claims Commission. And they say this. This comes from a man named James Dunbar, who was a prisoner of war in Frederick. He was a member of the 76th Regiment, the Highland Regiment, and he was captured at the Battle of Saratoga. He spent time in Frederick, and he heard all about what was happening with the Loyalist conspiracy. And this is what he told the Loyalist government about what he knew of the conspiracy, given his confinement in the Hessian barracks. And he said, quote, that the government, and he believed that the government and council had mitigated the sentence to hanging only, and that the said Caspar Fritchie used Plucker and Peter Suman were actually hanged by the neck until they were dead. So here, it's pretty clear that they were hanged, at least those 3, but they weren't hanged in a very brutal fashion. Also, I found this in the Maryland Historical Society, whatever it's called, in an unlabeled folder. I'm not telling anybody where I found it, because I know some people might want. But these are the actual notices of conviction that were sent to the governor. And on the back, you can see, things are the initial convictions scribbled out. And all we have at the bottom is the warrant of execution, the 11th of August, 1781, execution to be on Friday, the 17th of August, 1781. So because there's no other line beyond that, we can assume that's the day these people were executed, and we have that collaborated by the newspaper. So they are executed, but not in the grisly fashion that the ghost tours of Fredericktown will tell you they were executed. So what happened? There were 7 people initially convicted of leading the conspiracy. The truth about what happened is much more complicated than we might imagine. We know that 4 of the accused, Andrew Shells and the Graves brothers, were subsequently pardoned. More on them in a second. Actually, let's turn here to why they were pardoned. And this is the first. I don't want to toot my horn, but I will. I'm being recorded. So this is the first time that the dimensions of the plot beyond the execution have really been discussed, or these resources that came out in the months following the initial execution have been looked at. And what's remarkable, I think, about the treason plot is the degree to which the community gets involved in demanding clemency for those accused, perhaps freaked out, understandably, by the sentence that had initially been set down by the special court. So why did some conspirators escape death while others were made an example of to other would-be loyalists? Thomas Simley, the governor of Maryland, received dozens of letters and petitions from residents of Washington and Frederick counties in the weeks and months that followed the conviction of the 6 ringleaders of the conspiracy and the circulation of the broadside detailing their sentence. Perhaps spurred by the severity of the punishment, the majority of these letters asked the governor for mercy, especially when it came to the 4 younger men allegedly involved in organizing the plot. It is clear from the petitions that the 3 men central to Orndorff's testimony, Fritchie, Suman, and Plecker, received little public sympathy, and their execution was perhaps viewed as a just punishment by a majority of the residents of Western Maryland. In August and September 1781, a doctor and sometimes member of the circuit court, a man named Alexander Fisher, organized a petition on behalf of the four remaining ringleaders. Those four ringleaders were the Grave brothers, Henry Shell, and Nicholas Andrews. Another petition circulated soon after in Washington County. Gentlemen who did not initially sign these petitions started writing the governor throughout the autumn of that year, telling him that they want their names added to the petitions for clemency. One of the earliest petitions to arrive in Annapolis was organized by the ministers of the United German Congregations in Frederick. Again, the petition asked for clemency for the four young ringleaders. And this is what it read. During their imprisonment in Frederick jail, we, the ministers of the German congregations in Fredericktown, have found that their engaging in this plot was more owing to the insinuations and artifices of ill-designing people than to any depraved state of their own hearts, to which their want of education and inexperience rendered them the more liable. And as they have manifested their unfeigned destitution and sorrow for their past offenses, and given the most solemn assurances that the remainder of their lives shall fully testify the high sense they entertain of their country's clemency, we demand that clemency be extended to them. What's interesting here is that all of these petitions are obviously circulated at a time when the temperature is cooling in Western Maryland, as it's very clear that A, Cornwallis is not coming for Baltimore, and B, he's trapped in Yorktown. And it looks like his end is not, right? So at that point, why? Even if they are loyalists, out there, what are they going to do? Right? So that's something to consider before. The petitions, and this is what a few of those petitions look like that arrived. And here we can see on the left. You can't really see it. That many of those who signed the commissions signed with their names. This is particularly true of the German farmers who signed. They're not literate. They sign with their mark. A surprising percentage of them are illiterate. The petitions and letters from the West continued to arrive on the governor's desk in Annapolis into the new year, despite the fact that the conspiracies and ringleaders had by that time either been executed or pardoned. This correspondence pertains to the other men that had been rounded up following the discovery of the plot. The men who had pledged to support the insurrection, should they be called to do so. Their story has never been told. On the 27th of January, Fisher, who you'll remember had helped organize one of the earlier Frederick petitions, sent another letter to the governor in which he asked for leniency for the many men imprisoned in both the Washington and Frederick County jails. And from what we can gather, there are dozens of men who've been imprisoned for months on end without a trial by jury in both of those jails. On one occasion, one person writes to the governor and said, I thought the revolution rested on the concept of trial by jury, yet these men aren't getting that, right? So they point out they use the hypocrisy of the moment to illustrate their position. And this is what Fisher says. If I could be made sensible that such confinement from their families could be any way productive or good to the public, I would readily acquiesce thereon. But as upon the most mature deliberation, I must conclude the contrary to be the case. I thought it incumbent on me to apply to His Excellency, humbly requesting that the punishment of these unhappy people, whether respecting the extortionate fines to which they are sentenced, or the no less distressing part, by which I mean their confinement, I may receive such alleviation as His Excellency and by the Assembly etc. Must justly afford. There he's saying that there's no real use keeping these men in prison at this point. And their families are going hungry, they've missed the harvest already. On the 1st of February 1782, John Stoll, perhaps the sheriff of Washington County, I say that perhaps because I'm not quite sure who he is, though Henry Stoll is listed as the sheriff at that point. This man wrote to Lee on behalf of Henry Newcomer, the man who had initially given up the conspiracy, who remained in custody in Hagerstown. Stoll relayed to the governor that Newcomer's wife had visited, quote, her unfortunate husband, who had, quote, repented for what he had done. She threw herself at the mercy of the governor, claiming that, quote, she was in much distress, and asking if, quote, Your Excellency could favor upon the account of the distressed family as they are objects of compassion. Later that month, the governor received a petition from the men imprisoned for pledging their support for the plot then held in Washington County. The petition listed a dozen names, though a majority of the signers appear to have been illiterate. It asked the governor for mercy and the immediate release of the men. Quote, Your petitioners are now fully convinced of the impropriety of their past conduct, which has justly incurred the penalties imposed on us and consequently the censure and resentment of their injured country. But from a consciousness of their own guilt and with hearts filled with contrition, your petitioners are determined in future to convince the friends of America of their attachment to the American cause by a strict conformity to the laws of the country and in supporting and defending the present government to the utmost of their power. So what is the fruits of this? These are the convictions of both Henry Schell and George Graves. John and George Graves. I want to focus on John and George Graves for a second because they come up again. So we can see, again, the initial judgment is obliterated. It's written out. Instead, below it, we have a times table of what happened to these men. And it says, first there's a warrant of execution on the 11th of August, 1781. Execution to be on the 31st of August, 1781. Then there's further obliterated test. We find that the execution has been respited to Friday the 14th of September, 1781. And then finally we see that the two men are pardoned on condition that they enter on board one of His Most Christian Majesty's ships of war during the present conflict, or during the present war. At that point, the French fleet is docked in the Chesapeake, and so they are saved because they agreed to march and be placed in the French service, to be taken from the country and to fight for the Allies of America. That's the last we hear of these brothers in Maryland. Of course, not all of the inhabitants of Frederick and Washington counties agreed that treason should be so easily forgiven. One counter-petition sent to the governor from Washington County stated that, quote, a great majority of the free men of this country were, quote, much heated and very clamorous against the earlier campaigns for clemency. In the opinion of these men, those condemned for treason in Frederick jail were irredeemable. The petitioners could not, quote, conceive that they would ever become of any use to this country. Rather, they told the governor, quote, they would be very dangerous members of society in any station, and that it would be the greatest encouragement to conspirators that so small an example would be made as to one only to be executed out of 100 apprehended in this county. The petition ended with a final plea that the government would come to its senses for the public good, despite the campaigns for clemency organized by their deluded neighbors. They end their petition by saying, we humbly hope that Your Excellency will not be influenced by the tenderness of the petitioners, whose humanity in other causes we should esteem, but are fully of the opinion that the best cure for high treason is a rope. It is worth noting that those who signed the document largely hailed from the resident Anglican population, Anglican congregations. They were landed families. One of them was the then sheriff of Frederick County, and they were clearly English-speaking. They were from the English-speaking community. Like many other Loyalist conspiracies and movements in the West, the fallout from the Frederick treason plot clearly displays resident ethnic tensions over the supposed loyalty of the Germans in particular. Okay. So what has our regional case study taught us about the Loyalist experience in revolutionary America writ large? Has it helped diversify or expand our definition of what a Loyalist was? Well, I guess yes and no. Let's see how it may have altered our views on the subject. Firstly, it casts light on the existence of Loyalist sympathies in the West. And this is one of the great unknowns in early American history. We don't know what Westerners thought. I mean, the image of the Davy Crockett, Scots-Irish pioneer, looms large in our imagination, so we can imagine that all these people were loyal to the American cause. But that's clearly not the case. The sheer number of these conspiracies that come up on the Virginia and Maryland frontiers indicates that that's not true. So we know that there's loyalists in the West, but these people are poor, They can't get to the ports, they do not evacuate, and ultimately they make peace with their neighbors. They're integrated into American society. Let's take an example. Who knows who Barbara Fritchie is? Yeah. Barbara Fritchie, the woman who supposedly, though I'm not sure Jim would know, waved the Union flag over the Confederates as they marched through Frederick in 1862 or 64. I don't know, one of the two. It's all the same. It's all the But Fritchie, there's an argument that she wanted to claim that mantle because of the shame of her ancestors, because of the shame of the disloyalty of her ancestors. Therefore, I'm not going to make the mistake of my because it's either her uncle or her grandfather who's executed for treason. I'm not the traitor. I'll show the traitors what for. Anyway, so this episode casts doubt on the idea that the West is a monolith and that all Westerners are patriots. Secondly, does it cast light on the idea that there's an economic explanation for loyalism? That these agrarian farmers, burdened by high taxes, enforced by the Annapolis government in support for a war that seemed fairly remote to them, having endured these taxes for nigh on 6 years at that point, are they drawn to loyalty not for any ideological reason, but for an economic reason? And they note that those who have power and influence in the colony are the same people who had power and influence before. The Eastern slaveholding, aristocracy of the Bay. So is there an economic underpinning to Western loyalism in this region? It also sheds light on the nature of late war loyalism. To this day, most loyalist studies, and this is true of Brennan McConnell's recent studies, getting a lot of awards, they focus on the early stages of the war. Because it's easy, right? Because there's a clear, you have to make a choice in 1776. What side are you on? Right? But what about those who secretly harbored loyal sympathies and kept those sympathies alive well into the war? Right? And is this evidence of that? I would argue yes, based upon kind of the doozy I'm going to throw you at the end here. Also, it kind of sheds light on the agrarian nature of loyalist resentment. This is tied to that point about the economic exploitation. But remember, when I shared with you the statistics for the state of Maryland based upon the Loyalist Claims Commission records, only 14% of those Loyalist refugees were agriculturalists, were farmers. Right? I think there's a much higher percentage of farmers who harbor Loyalist sympathies throughout the world. Okay? So this is kind of an anecdote to that portrait of the Loyalists that we see emerge out of the Maryland Loyalism Project, which, by the way, is publicly available, and you can access it at loyalismproject.com if you'd like, and you can kind of see all the transcription notes students have done, you can look at the database, etc. But this is an interesting attendance to the work that they've done. But yet, I've read this to you before, but we'll read it again next. A turn to the British state records recently digitized on the Maryland Loyalism Project reveals a new dimension of the Frederick conspiracy cycle. Historians have long argued that local grievance and war exhaustion undergirded the Frederick conspiracy, and that ideology played a very small role in the affair. When we digitized the records of the Loyalist Claims Commission for the project, a few familiar names began to pop up, names that we have been told through the folklore and through the history of Frederick County had last left Maryland in the French service, where they likely died in the Caribbean. Yet these names appeared when we digitized our records. The names were of Adam and John or George Graves. Why, we asked, had the Graves submitted claims to the Loyalist Claims Commission? They had been granted pardon by the Maryland government. They claimed, at least to the Maryland government, that they had been duped by the key conspirators. Their fate was to join the French Navy for the duration of the war. But it appears from what we have here that they had escaped their captors en route to the French frigates anchored in the bay, and had made their way not to the Caribbean, but rather to British-occupied New York. We'll turn to their memorials they submitted to the LCC in a second, but I quickly want to go over the claim issued, or the statement issued by the German ministers of Frederick, in which they say that these people were not engaging in the plot out of malice, that they had been urged to do so owing to the insinuations and artifices of ill-designing people that had any depraved state of their own hearts, to which their want of education, these are just poor, dull German farmers, they can't be held culpable for what they've done. Let's see what they told the British government. This is their memorial submitted in 1786 to the Loyalist Claims Commission in London. They say, that your memorialists are natives of High Germany, who emigrated to America many years ago, where they on their arrival solemnly swore allegiance to His Majesty the King, and sometime afterwards settled themselves in Frederick, now or late Washington County, Maryland. Washington County becomes a county in 1736, so clearly they're not even aware when that happens, right? And so it's very late in the day. That your memorialists constantly demeaned themselves as becometh good and faithful subjects to do. That on the commencement of the late daring and wanton rebellion in the American colonies against the just rights and prerogative of the King and Parliament of Great Britain, your memorialists took a determined and decided part in favor of this country, and proceeded to enlist men to His Majesty's service, to serve the King in any of his American colonies during the rebellion. That soon after Adam Grave received a warrant under the hand and seal of Colonel Joseph Sands, appointing him a captive, bearing the date, the 9th day of May, 1779. Wow. And then later in the accounting we have Sands, who tells the same story, that he gave that look. Graves was a committed loyalist commissioned by the British Army in 1779 to rise up against the Americans when the time was right. So these are ideological loyalists. And I made the point of mentioning that crazy Irishman, Hugh Kelly, that came up in Orndorff's study. He's never found, but he does make it to London, and he tells his story. And I'm not going to go into it because I expect to go to London, the Loyalist Claims Commission papers of the Maryland Loyalist Project to read them yourself. But it's a fascinating story in which he hides out at the Dunker Church in Sharpsburg, grows a beard and pretends to be German. It doesn't go well for him. He's immediately discovered. But he too is a provocateur, sent by Henry Clinton to the Virginia and Maryland backcountry in order to raise loyalist conspiracies. He's not a boogeyman of the British Protestant imagination, as often these Irish figures are. Sometimes that boogeyman is real. He's there. These men are raising troops. This is an ideological conspiracy, if you believe these records. All right. So here we see an obvious ideological bent to the memorial. So I leave it with you. We have no firm answers. What is the nature of the Frederick treason plot? Is it an agrarian rebellion against high taxes, or is it an ideological rebellion against what they view to be an illegitimate The Frederick treason trials and their aftermath provide us with a case study of how communities in our region wrestled with questions of loyalty and forgiveness in the midst of a civil war. It also allows us to broaden our understanding of what a loyalist was at different points in the long war for American independence. A loyalist farmer in the West looks very different from the traditional image of the urbane and professional loyalist of the popular imagination. As we look to the coming 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, we would do well to remember the diversity of the loyalist experience. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Dr. Bankhurst?
Yeah, the East-West divide is really interesting. You know, that's been pretty well documented in North Carolina with the regulators basically rebelling against an overbearing and even abusive government dominated by Eastern planters.
Yeah.
Is the government in Maryland and the Western settlers in Maryland, does that have the same kind of divide? Was there something like a regulator movement in Maryland?
I would say no. I mean, we don't see it to the same extent. Clearly, when we come to the from 1780 to 1781, remember 1781 is also the year of the Articles of Confederation, so new state levies come in. To meet those levies, the Maryland government finally starts selling off confiscated Loyalist property. So in that context, there's a new tax burden on Westerners. So there is clearly a divide, and a long-standing divide between East and West. And that divide intensifies as we get into the early national period. But in terms of an armed regulator movement, we don't see anything like that. Though I think a lot of the grievances are there, just perhaps a lesser manifestation than in North Carolina. I mean, North Carolina is interesting because I think there you can make a very convincing case. This has little to do with ideology, right? I mean, the loyalist mercenaries and vigilante groups of the Carolinas they're tapping into pre-revolutionary grievance, right? I don't know if we can say that here. Though, I mean, what's interesting about what the Maryland government, and I have to find more examples of this, but my suspicion is that they don't know what to do with the Germans, right? They're not part of the British tradition that spawned Whiggery and then spawned the revolutionary movement, right? Just neighboring Pennsylvania in 1763, Benjamin Franklin refers to the Germans of Western Pennsylvania as those boorish Germans. They'll never be like us. They don't know our laws. They don't know our traditions. They don't speak our language. So I think there is a great deal of uncertainty in the East about Germans. Now there are German battalions, obviously. The German battalion was raised in Western Maryland from Washington County to service. But what we find if you look at the correspondence between representatives from Frederick and Washington counties in 1781 is there's a great deal of desertion from that union by the time we got here. And so get to the treason case. So there are tensions. There are ethnic tensions. There are social, economic tensions there. But to answer your question in a very roundabout way, I don't think you could see it to the same degree as in Carolina. That's what I think. Yeah.
A really quick question. The disavowalment and the threats in the 1781 document, when did England disallow that sort of execution?
Well, they do it during the American Revolution. Famously, they do it against John the Painter, a supposed terrorist who, with American sympathies, who tries to blow up the Portsmouth naval installation to try to keep the troops from reinforcing in North America. So I couldn't answer that. It must be much later.
I think it's I'd have to verify it, but I think it's the year of the French. When they have the United Irishmen, there's a couple of Colonel Despard, I think, who was one of the United Irishmen, who was a British officer. I think they if I get this right, they hanged him and then they cut off his head.
Right.
But it was this thing of like, we're not going to leave somebody with an intact body.
Right.
And there's they get into this thing of like handing over traitors to doctors to be anatomized.
Right.
Like, we're going to punish your body cutting it up kind of stuff in the 19th century.
Yeah, so I think much later. They're still doing it in the 1770s, and I do not doubt that the British are doing it in 1798, that's for sure. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, let's give Ben a hand.